The UK is a country of split opinions. A large section of this country are on the right, while another large section are on the left. Everyone knows the main news channels, BBC News and Sky News. Many people don't have a problem with either, but there are a select few people who demanded something different. These people wanted a new channel to get away from the BBC and Sky, who in their opinion are biased to the left. These people are looking for a channel that represents them. This is where two new channels are introduced, GB News and TalkTV. The first one of these two new TV channels to launch was GB News. GB News launched with one aim, to broadcast original news, opinion and debate. And in the words of former chairman and lead presenter Andrew Neil, the channel was aiming to target the vast number of British people who feel underserved and unheard by the media. GB News launched with names many of their target audience would recognise. This includes right-wing figures like Andrew Neil, Dan Wootton, Michelle Dewberry, Neil Oliver and Alex Phillips. These presenters were featured throughout the schedule. These weren't the only right-wing personalities that appeared on the channel. People like Tom Harwood, Nana Akua and Colin Brazier showed their opinions on air, which many members of the GB News audience agreed with. Not long after GB News launched, its lead presenter Andrew Neil announced that he was going to take a break. This meant that the presenter Colin Brazier stood in for him to present his primetime show. This wasn't the only thing that was happening with GB News at its time of launch. There were also multiple different tech issues that meant the channel was sometimes unbearable to watch. But this didn't stop the hardcore viewers from watching. They were hearing the opinions they wanted to hear, and there was nothing that would stop that. Or was there? The first GB News viewer boycott started. While live on air, the presenter Guti O'Harry took the knee live on air. This didn't please the majority of GB News viewers. The viewers started to boycott the channel by not watching it. This led to GB News having zero viewers shown at certain points of the day. GB News later sacked Guti O'Harry. GB News needed something to save them. They needed someone that the viewers would return for. They needed one of the biggest right-wing voices in the UK to come and save the channel. Who would it be? Katie Hopkins? Piers Morgan? Boris Johnson? No, it was the biggest weapon they had. Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage had joined GB News. The viewers were pouring in. The GB News viewers loved Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage on GB News is what Tucker Carlson was on Fox News. Someone who the audience shares all opinions with. With Farage's show taking the biggest ratings, GB News was getting comfortable with it being the only place that the right-wing audience could go for the opinions that they wanted to hear. But, in the shadows, there was one man who was up for grabs, Piers Morgan. With many people speculating that Piers Morgan would join GB News, they wouldn't expect him to go anywhere else. May I introduce to you the next right-wing TV channel, TalkTV. You may already be aware of the Talk brand, with Talk Sports and Talk Radio, but they were ready to bring out their biggest weapon, something that could compete with GB News, a channel which promised that straight talking starts here. With the announcement of TalkTV, many people started to wonder who would be appearing on this channel, since GB News has already taken most of the prominent right-wing personalities, but there was still a chunk of them left. With TalkTV broadcasting most of its content that is appearing on Talk Radio, they already have some of the biggest names presenters like Julia Hartley-Brewer and Mike Graham. But they were missing someone who could host a primetime show, someone who could compete with their rival GB News. And they did. Talk announced their lineup. This included Sharron Osborne, Tom Newton-Dunn, and someone who everyone in the UK knows, Piers Morgan. Piers Morgan announced that he was joining TalkTV with a brand new primetime show, Piers Morgan Uncensored.
No, but not mine.
No.
See you later.
I'm being...
Sorry, can't do this.
A year ago today, I was forced to leave a job that I loved, at the peak of its success, for having the audacity to express an honestly held opinion. Well, this shouldn't happen in any democracy, supposedly built on the principles of free speech and freedom of expression. So I'm delighted to now be returning to live television with a new primetime show whose main purpose will be to cancel the cancel culture which has infected societies around the world. I want it to be a platform for lively, vigorous debate, for newsmaking interviews, and that increasingly taboo three-letter word, fun. I also want it to annoy all the right people. I'm Piers Morgan, Uncensored.
Piers Morgan Uncensored wasn't just going to broadcast on TalkTV. This show was also going to be broadcast on Sky News Australia and Fox Nation. The show needed something to bring up interest in not just the new show, but also the new channel. They found what they needed. TalkTV announced that the first edition of Piers Morgan Uncensored will include an interview with the former US President, Donald Trump.
Okay, Piers, I'm ready.
A former president in denial.
I'll be completely straight with you to your face.
I think I'm a very honest man. Much more honest than you, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
It was a free and fair election. You lost.
Only a fool would think
You
that.
think I'm a fool?
I do now, yeah.
With respect.
Excuse me.
Okay, but with respect, you haven't produced the hard evidence.
Excuse me.
The most explosive interview of the
I
year.
don't think you're real. It's
realise
just
I'm not like-
very
I
dishonest.
just-
Let's finish up the interview.
Morgan versus
Turn the
Trump.
camera up. Very dishonest.
Only on Talk TV.
Now, this wasn't made easy. Piers Morgan announced live on his show that the interview was close to being cancelled. This is because of some information that Donald Trump received about Piers Morgan's past comments about him. This information was passed to him by somebody who could have been afraid of the launch of another right-wing TV channel in the UK. Yes, Nigel Farage. Nigel's attempt to disrupt this big launch of Talk TV failed, with the interview going ahead. A promotional video was launched about the Trump interview. This again caused more drama. Trump published a statement telling his loyal fans that the interview, which hadn't aired yet at this point, was edited. This made front page news. In return, this made people more engaged for the launch of TalkTV and Piers Morgan Uncensored. TalkTV launched on the 25th of April 2022. It started with a show called The News Desk with presenter Tom Newton-Dunn. This show launched with American-style graphics and intense music. As with the previous launch of competitor GB News, there were some technical issues. Well, in fact, there were only one. The microphone and video feed was slightly out of sync. This was fixed later in the programme. Apart from that, it was a successful show. Following this show, the UK, the US, Australia and the world got to see the launch of Piers Morgan Uncensored. This was watched by over 317,000 people in the UK alone. This gave GB News its biggest threat that they have had since launch. Piers Morgan was back on TV and plastered on every bus stop. Moving on a bit, both of these channels continued on, with GB News hiring people like the Reclaim Party leader Lawrence Fox, Tory Party Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg, comedian John Cleese, and Reform Party leader Richard Tice, and TalkTV hiring Jeremy Kyle, Vanessa Feltz, Rosanna Lockwood, and the former Tory MP Nadine Dorries. TalkTV wasn't having the best luck, with most shows gaining a low amount of viewership, and only special interviews on Uncensored getting a good amount of reception in the UK. GB News did have a strong viewership on some of its shows like Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel, Farage and Dan Wootton Tonight, but something was about to happen that shook the entire process of GB News. Allegations emerged about the presenter Dan Wootton saying he was involved in using fake online identities and offering money to others for explicit material of themselves. This left GB News in a position where they would have to decide what they should do. A. Suspend Dan Wootton and hold a formal investigation. B. Not mention it at all and pretend nothing has happened. Well, GB News did none of these. Instead, they sent Dan Wootton on air.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel. I'm Dan Wootton. And as a journalist, I feel uncomfortable being the story. But I've always promised you that this show has no spin and no bias and no censorship. So I owe it to you to address this. These past few days, I have been the target of a smear campaign by nefarious players with an axe to grind. Notably, by an ex-partner who I was, and this is something I've never spoken about and is very difficult to talk about publicly, but who I was previously abused by. He has written to me confessing to being a, quote, psychopath, and I saw this firsthand when he threatened in writing to, quote, slit my throat. He has created an untrue story about me and appears to have been working with an organisation who are intent on closing down this channel. I, like all fallible human beings, have made errors of judgment in the past, but the criminal allegations being made against me are simply untrue. But on the advice of my lawyers, I cannot comment further. I mean, who doesn't have regrets? We must be, and that's why GB News exists. What we're trying to do here is something different, to give a voice to the long-forgotten people of the United Kingdom.
Following this, there were no more comments by GB News. While TalkTV's ratings continued to fall, GB News found itself in another controversy. This involved the presenter Lawrence Fox and again, the presenter Dan Wootton. This entire controversy was over misogynistic comments made by Lawrence Fox on Dan Wootton's show. GB News finally did something. They suspended Lawrence Fox. Then, after Lawrence Fox posted some messages with Dan Wootton supporting him, they suspended Dan Wootton. Then following this, Calvin Robinson was suspended for supporting them both. This left the 9 to 11 PM show without a presenter. This was until Friday to Sunday 9 to 11 presenter Mark Dolan stood in.
I didn't expect to be sat here tonight. I was going to wash my hair and watch Coronation Street. But unless you've been living under a rock or don't have internet access, you'll be aware that GB News presenter Lawrence Fox appeared on the channel last night and made some offensive comments about the journalist. Whether Lawrence should stay on air is not my decision, and Dan's absence tonight is also beyond my control. There is an investigation ongoing, but the comments made by Lawrence, in my view, were sexist, misogynistic, and unusually, in the frenzied climate of the so-called culture wars, have been condemned across the political spectrum, from left and right, and even the Liberal Democrats, wherever they are.
This received some backlash, as hardcore GB News fans started to go against Mark Dolan for not standing in support of Dan Wootton and declining the invitation to present in his time slot. A bit later on, it was announced Lawrence Fox and Calvin Robinson were sacked by GB News, with the investigation of Dan Wootton continuing. This led to Calvin making his own statement exposing GB News. It has been weeks since this happened, and Dan Wootton is still suspended. The future of his career at GB News is looking slim. With the suspension of GB News' most popular presenters came backlash. GB News' viewership kept dropping. This is what I'm labelling as the second viewer boycott. This has led to GB News having its worst performing shows since launch. The GB News viewers are trying to cancel the channel that they supported for helping cancel culture. While all this is going on, TalkTV was putting together a brand new lineup, with a brand new breakfast show hosted by Jeremy Kyle and Nicola Thorpe, a brand new made-for-TV version of the Independent Republic of Mike Graham, Julia Hartley-Brewer moving to afternoons, and Rosanna Lockwood presenting a new primetime show. Since the launch of this, there has been many complaints from the viewers over at TalkTV. They don't agree with Julia moving slots, they don't like the fast-paced moving graphics, and they just don't like Rosanna Lockwood. This has led to TalkTV not getting the success they hoped for. Altogether, the current state of right-wing TV in the UK is poor, proving that these American-style, opinionated, personality-driven TV channels don't work inside this country. The success of the unbiased BBC, Sky and ITV is shown throughout their ratings. People in the UK want news as news, not news as Nigel Farage or Piers Morgan. That is why right-wing TV has failed in the UK, and this has been the rise and fall of right-wing TV in the UK.